What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This is episode 19, and in this one we are covering the monthly reading wrap-up in TBR like I normally do on the first Monday of every month, but this time we're covering both April and May. I didn't have one of these videos come out in May. I've already discussed this in previous videos. April, I had a crazy work schedule, and there was no way that I was going to be able to do one of these for May. So, we're covering both April and May today. And I gotta say, despite my work schedule being so crazy in April, I got a lot done because I was working night shifts and doing what I do. I had a surprising amount of time to read, but let's just go ahead and start what I read in April. Firstly, I finished The Wastelands, which is book 3 in the Dark Tower by Stephen King. To be clear, I read probably like 85 or 90% of this in March, so saying I finished this in April is just kind of a technicality for me at this point. It's not like I actually read very much of it. I just finished it in the first couple days of the month, and that was that. I think I'll have a review of this coming out on the second Monday of July, if that's how the schedule's all going. I can't remember exactly when recording and editing and all this stuff will be able to take place, but I'm pretty sure that's when this is occurring. So be on the lookout for that, and sneak peek, you're going to see a lot more of this today in this video. The next book that I got through in April was Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. I think that's how you pronounce it. Again, I'm really not great with Russian. So this was a crazy book. Fever Dreamy was definitely a good way to describe it in the last one of these videos that I talked about it. And I will say I enjoyed it quite a bit, though. This was probably the closest that I came to DNFing a book, though, because it's split into two parts, book 1 and book 2. The last few chapters of book 1 are crazy. They're not that great. They're just like it's really hard to describe. Things just kind of mount up and things get insane for those last few chapters of book 1. And if you decide to just take a break between books 1 and 2, like me, it became a really difficult feat to want to read book 2 again. It took a little bit of convincing and a little bit of explanation about certain things from some friends on Discord before I was like, okay, I've got to actually finish this book. So this is definitely not going to be one for everybody, that is for sure, but I think maybe it'll be later this year. I don't know how the schedule for anything goes at this point. I'm just kind of dead and exhausted right now. I think I'll have a Count the Classics episode coming out on this. It definitely deserves a little bit more in-depth coverage than just a normal review. But yeah, it was a crazy book. I am glad I finished it, though, because the last several chapters of book 2, the very end of the book, just wrapped things up in a way that I was really happy with. Normally, when I do these videos, I talk about which book did I read after the one that I just previously finished. This was one of the few instances of actually starting another book when I was in the middle of the previous one. Like I said, I took a break after book 1 of Master and Margarita, and in that break I read part 1 of Wizard and Glass, which is basically just the finale of The Wastelands, which bothers me, but I'll get into that when I have a review of this coming out in August. I don't know, sometime later this year. I really, really enjoyed this book. I knew that there was a lot of mixed feelings on Wizard and Glass because a lot of people weren't happy with the flashback, or they didn't know the flashback was happening, so it just felt like a drag because they wanted to go on with the main story, stuff like that. But I knew that most of this book was going to be a flashback ahead of time, so I was actually kind of surprised to find that only like 85% of this, well, maybe even not that much, like maybe 80% of this book is a flashback. I was thinking like more of it was going to be, but I was very happy with this, and in my review of it, you'll see me gush about it a lot. I just absolutely loved this thing. But after I finished both of those two previous books, I decided to go with something a little bit different. So I read The Andromeda Evolution. This is by Daniel H. Wilson, but it is in the spirit of Michael Crichton. It was written as a sequel to The Andromeda Strain. Now, I knew that I wanted to read this after The Andromeda Strain before I got into any other Michael Crichton stuff, because I just kind of wanted to see what it was about, like what a different author was going to do with the IP and see if it was like an actually worthy sequel. And I think in total it ended up being a serviceable sequel. It's good enough that I'm not going to chase people off from reading it if they're interested. Like, if you're interested in reading this after you read The Andromeda Strain, go right on ahead. There's a lot of things about it that are really great, but there's also a lot of things about it that are quite messy, which I did cover quite in depth, not spoilery, but quite in depth in a Goodreads review that I did, which, yeah, I do have a Goodreads now, goodreads.com/King Crusoe. It was the first review that I did on there, but I will have a video review as well where I kind of outline some of those things as well. I think it was a serviceable sequel. I enjoyed it enough. It was just a quick, easier read after spending so much time on Wizard and Glass and being so brain busted by Master and Margarita. And then the last thing that I read in April, which wasn't a full book, I managed to get through all of Volume 2 of War and Peace. So that's like 380 pages of this or something like that. And since it takes me like 3 or so minutes to read each page, yeah, I zoomed through Volume 2 of War and Peace. And I was really happy, or, well, happy's not the right term. I really enjoyed what I read of it, but the end of Volume 2, man, left me really depressed. So I was very hesitant to continue on. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't want to be depressed again. That was what I read in April, and before I move on to what I read in April, my book of the month for April, as you could probably tell by the way that I covered these, was Wizard and Glass, like hands down. There wasn't anything I read that even touched this. This is one of my more favorite books of the year so far, just because of that flashback. That flashback is so good. But now that I've talked about all of that fancy stuff, let's cover what I read in May. First thing that I read in May, it actually took me a little bit. I took a little bit of a break after finishing Volume 2 of War and Peace because I read so much at work in April that when my work schedule finally let up a little bit and I was just getting into Wind of the Keyhole, I was taking it really slow. Like, I could probably have finished this in 3 or 4 days. It ended up taking me something like 10 or so as a rough estimate. It took me a long time just because I was a little bit burnt out and I was gaming a lot more since I had time to game. But I was rather surprised by this. I'm not going to lie. I was rather surprised because Wizard and Glass had a lot of mixed reviews, at least what I've heard from people who read it at release or whatnot. It was really mixed because people wanted to continue on with the main story and weren't expecting the flashback. But those who were expecting the flashback or who wanted the flashback really enjoyed it. This is a little bit more of a mixed bag, I think, in total, because it was written after the whole series was completed. So, and it takes place in between books 4 and 5, so it's not like a necessary part of the tower. It just kind of goes a little bit more into Roland's backstory, kind of the way that Wizard and Glass did. And I will admit, reading this right after Wizard and Glass felt a little bit weird because doing 2 books where there was like a little bit of, actual stuff happening in the beginning and then a flashback and then, the end and whatnot felt a little bit weird. But I do think this differentiated itself from Wizard and Glass enough that it didn't really bother me. But the flashback and the story within the story within the story that does happen in this book, because that is a thing, I really liked how it all came together, to be honest. I did do a review of this in Goodreads as well, but I will also have a video review coming out in August if you're interested in that, when I'm covering all of my Dark Tower stuff. I do have to commend this for being a lot better than I was expecting. I don't know if I personally would have enjoyed this as much reading it at the end because, I haven't read the whole series, so I don't know how it finishes, but I'm not one who likes going back to books that are meant to be in the middle of the series, after or whatnot. Like, it's hard to explain, but I'm glad I read this when I did because I wasn't super anxious to get on with the main story, but I'll just leave it at that. The next book that I read in May was Pride and Prejudice. This was the monthly classics book that we went through in May, just like Master Margarita was the monthly classic in Discord for April. If Master Margarita was the closest that I came to DNFing a book at the point that I read it, this was the closest that I came to DNFing a book at this point. But at the same time, this is actually proof of why I don't like to DNF books unless I'm absolutely hating what I'm reading. The first volume of it, this copy of it, the Penguin's Deluxe Edition, Penguin Classics Deluxe, it has it split into 3 volumes. Most of volume 1 was really slow and really boring. The first few chapters are surprisingly like a lot to take in. So there was just kind of, it was really slow, it wasn't interesting me, and I didn't really care about any of the characters yet or anything like that, because this is mostly a book about if you care about the characters or the drama, or if you want to, experience like the way that relationships or, the interactions of people evolve throughout. That's what this book is about. So volume one was really slow for me in a way that made me heavily consider just putting it down and, for all intents and purposes, it would have been a DNF, but be like, maybe I'll come back to this in 10 or 15 years when I'm older or something like that and see if I enjoy it more then. But I'm really glad I pushed through because volume two started to evolve things in a way that I was really interested in. And as I said on my Goodreads review of this, Volume 3 wrapped everything up in a fantastic way. The last several chapters made me even appreciate and see the first several chapters in a way that made me actually think of them more fondly. I don't hate Volume 1 of this book as much as I did when I was still reading it, just because of how the book ended. So I'm excited to actually go back to this again in, 10, 20 years and, knowing what happens at the end and actually going through the beginning and knowing the characters as well and seeing how I experience it then. Even though this very closely became a DNF for me, it is a prime example of why I don't like to, because in the end, there's usually something that I can get out of it, or even if I still don't like it. I really enjoyed this when I finished it, but with books, if I decide DNF, if I don't get to the end, there's no way for me to decide if there's something to appreciate about it. But so I'm glad that I finished that book because I did enjoy it more than I was thinking I was going to in the middle of reading it. And then the final full book that I read in May was Wolves of the Kala. I was thinking that this book was going to easily bleed me into June by a few days, but it only took me like 7 or 8 days to read this entire thing, and it's not that much shorter than Wizard and Glass was, so I was really surprised by how fast I read it, but I enjoyed it. It's a little bit side questy, and that's the primary complaint that I've heard about it. But at the same time, there was a lot of stuff that happened primarily in part one, but also in part three as well, that really like hint at things that are going to happen in the future, like in the finale, and do push the story forward and at least introduce new concepts and ideas to the series that are going to be used in the finale, at least I presume. So I really appreciated what it did. And even though part two was definitely a little bit slow and dragged a little bit for me, I did surprisingly enjoy this a lot. I think I like it more than, I don't know, at least two, probably maybe even three of the other books in the series so far, which says a lot considering I've only read 6 of the 8 of them. Since I'm recording this on May 29th, it's still not quite the end of May yet, but I have started Volume 3 of War and Peace. That's why I kind of set it over here instead of over there with the completed stuff. So I'm not super far into Volume 3 yet. I hope to be done with Volume 3 Part 1 tonight as of recording this, but we'll see what happens. So yeah, I don't really have much to say about Volume 3 because I'm just barely starting it, but it's nice to note that, hey, with the last few days of May happening, this is what I'm going through at the moment. So, now that we've covered everything that I've read in May, my book of the month for May was also a Dark Tower book. It was Wolves of the Kala. While I was reading Pride and Prejudice, whatnot, I was thinking that Wind Through the Keyhole would be my book of the month. But when I got through this, I decided that this definitely outranks Wind Through the Keyhole for me. Even though I appreciate what that was doing, this is kind of the mainline Tower book, was a really good one. So that's the book of the month for May. Books 4 and 5 of the series ended up being my books of the month for the last couple months. I guess that kind of says something about the quality of the series. But now that I've covered all of that, it's time to actually get into the TBR for June. This is going to be a pretty short section. Like I've mentioned, I've just barely started Volume 3, so I'm at the very least going to finish Volume 3 of War and Peace in June, but I do hope to get through Volume 4. And depending on what happens and how long it takes me to read different parts of this, as well as the next book that I'm going to talk about here, I may even be able to get through the epilogue since it's only 100 pages and I can do that in 2 or 3 days. We'll see what happens, but I hope to at least get through, well, I'm going to get through Volume 3. I hope to get through Volume 4. We'll see about the epilogue. It kind of depends on when time allows and all that kind of stuff. Finally working my way through War and Peace, and I'm happy about that. I'm really hoping to have this thing done at the very least before August, but if I can have it done before July, that'll be nice too. The next book that I plan to read in June is actually the only full book that I plan to read in June, which we'll talk about in just a second. That's Song of Susanna by Stephen King. You probably saw this coming, given that I've been reading Dark Tower rather slow. I love the purple color here. I just love it so much. But that's a side note. Um, I've heard that this is probably like the most mixed book of the entire Dark Tower series because it just gets really weird and I guess it's structured a little bit weird. Like, I don't know the details, but I think this is probably, along with Wind Through the Keyhole slash The Gunslinger, this is definitely near the bottom of the series, but I'm still excited about it. The way that Wolves of the Call ended made me think about this book and just like, okay, I'm going to go in a little bit tentatively and assuming that it's going to be weird and maybe even like do some things that I'm not going to like with it. But given the way that Wolves of the Call ended, I'm really excited to kind of, or I'm really anxious, I guess, to get into Song of Susanna and see what's going on because, wow, Wolves of the Call just ended in a crazy way, and I need to get through this. So hopefully it only takes me a few days here in the middle of the month. But when I finish Song of Susanna, I'm going to be going into the next monthly classics book for the read along. But this time, instead of being 1 month for the book, this book will be encompassing June and July because it's Count of Monte Cristo. Look at me go with all the big, chunky books, especially the classics, going on in 2022. But this is one that I'm really excited for. This is a book that I think basically everybody I know who's read it says it's one of the best books they've ever read, one of their favorites, one of the best books of all time. It's the quintessential revenge tale, all of that, whatnot. So I'm really excited to actually get into what's going on with it. I did read like the introduction and the note on the text and whatnot that's included in this edition. It made me like, I want to start this now, but I have too many other things that I need to do first, primarily getting through most of War and Peace and doing some more Dark Tower stuff. But I'm really excited to do this, but I won't be reading all this in June. That's why I said Song of Susanna is going to be the only book that I completely read in June, because this, even if I'm reading super quick, like even at the quicker of my pace, this book is probably going to take me a little over a month. This is going to take me probably until halfway through July or something. But that's why we have 2 months to read this one, because it's big. It's going to take all that time. So I'm going to be starting this book in June, and I'm really excited for it. But that's all that I need to go into in this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry for it being a little bit longer because I had to cover, everything that I read for 2 months worth of stuff. Next month, this video shouldn't be nearly as long, so we'll just see how things kind of go with that. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel. But most importantly, if you want to support me in what I do, you can check out all of my videos in the backlog on seasonalproductions.com, where all of my writing also comes out. So if you want to go there and bookmark it, it's recently been reworked and revamped. Everything's basically been rebuilt. If you want to go check that out, I would greatly appreciate it. But with that being said, this is the end of this video. I think this Friday is when the book haul for this month comes out, but I could be misremembering. If nothing else, I'll be back again next week with another episode of the Book Binge.